The world did not end in fire. It ended, for many of our forgotten ancestors, in water. Imagine standing on a shore that no longer exists, beneath a sky colder and clearer than any sky we know today. Behind you are forests of birch and pine, herds of wild horses, reindeer, mammoths, and the small fires of human families who have lived on this land for generations. In front of you is not the sea as we know it, but a wide plain stretching far toward the horizon. Children run where fish now swim. Hunters follow animal tracks across valleys that are now buried under gray water. Caves, camps, burial grounds, paths, stories, and names all belong to a world that the ocean has not yet taken. Then, slowly at first, the ice begins to die. At the end of the last ice age, around 12,000 years ago, Earth passed through one of the greatest climate transformations in human memory. Vast ice sheets that had covered North America and northern Europe began to melt. Glaciers retreated like wounded giants. Rivers swelled. Lakes larger than modern nations formed behind walls of ice. Sea levels rose by roughly 400 feet from their ice age low point, swallowing coastlines, plains, forests, river mouths, and perhaps the earliest places where human communities had learned to gather, trade, worship, and remember. This story is about that drowned world. It is a story of Doggerland, the lost plain between Britain and Europe, where people once walked across land now hidden beneath the North Sea. It is a story of Sundaland, the vast tropical shelf of Southeast Asia, where islands were once joined into a single, living landscape before the sea divided them. It is a story of the Black Sea, where some researchers have argued that rising waters may have broken through and transformed a freshwater basin into something much larger and darker. It is a story of Lake Agassiz, a giant glacial lake in North America whose outbursts may have helped disturb ocean currents and climate. And it is a story of Lake Missoula, whose ice dam failed again and again, sending floods across the American Northwest with enough force to carve the bones of the land itself. But this is not only a story about water, it is a story about memory. Across the world, from Mesopotamia to India, from Greece to the Americas, from the Pacific Islands to ancient China, people preserve stories of great floods. Some speak of gods, some speak of warnings, some speak of boats, mountains, drowned cities, chosen survivors, and new beginnings. We cannot say that every flood myth comes from the same event. Human beings have always lived near rivers and seas, and floods are among the oldest terrors of settled life. Yet it is possible that some of these legends carry an echo of something real, something immense, something inherited from ancestors who watched the edges of their world vanish beneath the tide. Over the next 8 chapters, we will move slowly through that vanished age. We will begin in the frozen world before the melt, then follow the warming, the sudden return of cold during the Younger Dryas, the bursting of glacial lakes, the drowning of coastal worlds, and the birth of flood legends. We will look at how disaster may have pushed human beings to migrate, to farm, to build, to measure water, to fear the sky, and to dream of civilizations older than memory. Finally, we will return to our own time, when glaciers are again retreating, seas are again rising, and the past seems to whisper across 12,000 years. Listen closely. The water is still speaking. Before the great melting, before the drowned plains, before the legends of flood and renewal, there was ice, not a thin winter ice that comes and goes with the season, not frost on a morning field, or snow gathered softly on a roof. This was ice of another order, ice that remade continents, bent the crust of the earth, and locked so much water away from the oceans that the seas themselves withdrew from the edges of the world. During the final phase of the last ice age, especially during the period known as the last glacial maximum, roughly 26,000 to 19,000 years ago, enormous ice sheets covered much of the northern hemisphere. In North America, the Laurentide ice sheet spread across what is now Canada and reached into the northern United States. Beside it, the Cordilleran ice sheet pressed down over the mountains of western Canada and the Pacific Northwest. In Europe, ice-buried Scandinavia pressed into Britain and stretched across the northern plains. Farther south, mountain glaciers gleamed in the Alps, the Himalayas, the Andes, and other high places of the world. To a human being living then, the map of Earth would have looked profoundly unfamiliar. The coastline was not where it is now. So much water was trapped inside glaciers that global sea level was more than 300 feet lower than today, and in some estimates, close to 400 feet lower at its lowest point. Continental shelves that are now underwater stood open to the wind and sun. The North Sea was not a sea in the way we know it. It was a broad, low landscape of rivers, marshes, lakes, and grazing animals. Britain was not an island. People and animals could move across Doggerland between the European mainland and what is now eastern England. In Southeast Asia, the difference was even more dramatic. The shallow seas around modern Indonesia, Malaysia, Borneo, Sumatra, Java, and the Malay Peninsula were partly exposed, forming a great tropical landmass called Sundaland. Today, we see islands scattered across blue water. Then, much of that region was joined by forest, river, coast, and plain. To the south, Australia, New Guinea, and Tasmania were also connected into a larger landmass known as Sahul. Far to the north, between Siberia and Alaska, another exposed bridge of land, Beringia, connected Asia and North America. It was not merely a narrow bridge, it was a vast, cold steppe, a world of grasses, shrubs, animals, wind, and human possibility. The Ice Age Earth was not silent or empty, it was alive. Across the mammoth steppe, woolly mammoths moved in slow procession, their curved tusks sweeping like pale moons before them. Woolly rhinoceroses grazed in frozen grasslands. Reindeer and wild horses traveled in herds. Bison left dark tracks across snow and mud. Cave lions watched from ridges. Wolves followed the movements of both animals and humans. In warmer refuges, forests survived, and in river valleys, people found shelter, wood, stone, fish, and game. Human beings were already old in the world. By the time the great ice began to retreat, our species had crossed deserts, mountains, forests, and shorelines. People had painted animals deep inside caves. They had carved figures from ivory and bone. They had buried their dead with care. They had learned the habits of migrating herds, the seasons of plants, the language of stone, the making of fire, the shaping of tools, and the fragile art of survival. They had stood beneath the stars for thousands upon thousands of nights and told stories, because even in the coldest age, human beings were never only hunters. They were rememberers. Let us imagine one such community. They live near the edge of a river plain, not far from what will one day become a seabed. Their shelters are made from hides, wood, bone, and earth. Smoke rises in a thin blue column from a central fire. The older people know where flint can be found, where herds cross in autumn, where fish gather when the water drops, and where the ground becomes dangerous after thaw. Children learn by watching. They learn how to read footprints, how to listen for cracking ice, how to scrape hides clean, how to sit quietly when the wind changes. The ocean is far away. Perhaps they have heard of it from travelers. Perhaps someone in the group has seen it, a distant shining line beyond many days of walking. But for this family, the world is land. It is open country, wetland, riverbank, forest edge, and frozen grass. The places where they gather shellfish are miles beyond our modern beaches. The places where they bury their dead may now lie under shipping lanes. Their stories may have been spoken beside fires where fishing boats pass today. This is one of the great difficulties in studying the deep human past. So much of what mattered to Ice Age people was probably near water. Rivers offered food, movement, and orientation. Coastlines offered shellfish, fish, birds, seals, driftwood, and routes of travel. Estuaries and wetlands were rich places where humans could live with fewer risks than on the open steppe. Yet many of those ancient coasts are now drowned. The archaeological record we find on land may be only the higher, drier remnant of a much broader human world. In other words, the sea may be covering some of the most important chapters of our early history. For a long time, the end of the Ice Age was imagined as a simple warming, a gentle turning from cold to warmth, like winter slowly becoming spring. But the real story was more restless. Climate did not change in a smooth line. It lurched. It paused. It reversed. It surged forward again. The end of the Ice Age was not one event, but a sequence of changes, some gradual and some abrupt, all unfolding across a planet loaded with ice. When the climate warmed, glaciers began to melt at their edges. Streams ran from the ice in summer, valleys filled with meltwater. Rivers became braided and wild, shifting across gravel beds. In front of the ice sheets, water pooled in low places, sometimes trapped by the ice itself. These were not ordinary lakes. Some were so vast they resembled inland seas. Their shores changed as the ice changed. Their levels rose and fell. Their waters pressed against unstable dams of ice, sediment, and rock. A glacier can look eternal, but it is always moving. It flows under its own weight, slowly, heavily, like a frozen river. It advances when snow and ice accumulate faster than they melt. It retreats when melting wins. At the end of the Ice Age, melting began to win more often. The white walls that had dominated the north started to pull back. Land that had been buried for tens of thousands of years saw the sky again. Plants followed. Animals followed. Human beings followed too. But retreating ice is dangerous ice. It leaves behind cliffs, crevasses, unstable lakes, and sudden floods. It changes the courses of rivers. It releases stones and sediment ground fine by the pressure of ages. It uncovers land that rebounds upward after being freed from the crushing weight of ice. It sends cold fresh water into the ocean, where that water can interfere with currents that help move heat around the planet. It creates a world in transition, and transitional worlds are rarely peaceful. Around 14,700 years ago, Earth entered a warmer interval, often called the Bowling-Allarod warming. Temperatures rose in many regions. Forests spread. Ice retreated. Sea level climbed. For human communities, this warming may have brought new opportunities. More plants, more animals in some regions, more open pathways into lands once blocked by ice. But it also brought loss. Coasts shifted, rivers changed. Old hunting grounds became marsh. Marsh became lagoon. Lagoon became sea. Then came one of the strangest interruptions in climate history. Around 12,900 years ago, after centuries of warming, much of the northern hemisphere suddenly cooled again. This cold period is known as the Younger Dryas. It lasted more than 1,000 years. In some regions, conditions returned almost to glacial severity. The name comes from a small Arctic flower, Dryas octopetala, whose pollen appears in sediments from that cold interval. It is a delicate name for a harsh time. The causes of the Younger Dryas are still debated, but one leading idea is that massive releases of fresh water from melting ice and glacial lakes disrupted ocean circulation in the North Atlantic. The ocean is not simply water. It is a moving engine of heat, salt, density, and current. Warm water travels northward. Cold, salty water sinks. This circulation helps regulate climate. Pour enough cold, fresh water into the system, and the engine can weaken or shift. The result may be abrupt cooling across wide regions. For the people living through it, there was no name called Younger Dryas. There were only seasons that failed to behave. Imagine elders telling children that the winters had once been shorter. Imagine hunters watching herds change their routes. Imagine plants vanishing from familiar slopes. Imagine a family returning to a valley and finding it colder, drier, less generous than before. Human beings had survived climate change before, but survival does not make suffering unreal. 1,000 years is not a brief event when measured in human lives. It is dozens of generations. It is long enough for old memories to become myth and new hardships to become the normal shape of the world. During this unstable age, humans were also changing. In the Near East, some communities had begun to gather wild grains more intensively. In places such as the Levant, people associated with the Natufian culture built more permanent settlements than many earlier hunter-gatherers. They harvested grasses, stored food, buried their dead near their homes, and lived in a world where the boundary between foraging and farming was beginning to blur. The Younger Dryas may have placed pressure on these communities by making wild resources less predictable. Some researchers have suggested that this pressure helped push humans toward cultivation, not as a sudden invention, but as a long conversation with hunger, memory, and experiment. This matters because water and climate are not background details in the story of civilization. They are the stage itself. A people who can no longer rely on old hunting paths must find new ones. A people whose coastline disappears must move inland or learn the new shore. A people whose river floods unpredictably must watch, measure, remember, and eventually manage. The earliest villages, fields, canals, and flood myths were not born in a world of stability. They emerged from a world where climate had shown its power again and again. At the same time, far from the first villages, the ice was preparing other disasters. In western North America, enormous volumes of water gathered behind ice dams. Lake Missoula, in what is now Montana, formed when glacial ice blocked a river valley and trapped meltwater in a mountain basin. Again and again, the ice dam failed. When it failed, water rushed westward with terrifying force. These floods tore across the landscape, scoured soil from bedrock, carved channels, ripped out stones, and shaped the channeled scablands of the Pacific Northwest. They were not like river floods that rise over days. They were continent-scale pulses of violence, sudden and immense. Farther east and north, Lake Agassiz grew along the retreating margin of the Laurentide ice sheet. At different times, it covered huge areas of central North America. Its water shifted outlets as ice and land changed. When portions of that water escaped, they may have sent vast floods through river systems toward the Arctic Ocean, the Gulf of Mexico, or the North Atlantic. These releases are among the suspects in the mystery of abrupt climate change at the end of the Ice Age. Picture these glacial lakes in the silence before failure. A wall of ice stands at the far shore, blue-white and cracked. Behind it, water stretches for miles, cold and deep, reflecting a sky full of pale light. The ice groans. Water finds a weakness. A channel opens. Pressure grows. Then the wall begins to break. At first, perhaps, there is only a sound like thunder trapped underground. Then a rush. Then a roar so large it becomes the whole world. Trees vanish. Boulders move. Valleys become rivers. Rivers become inland seas. The flood does not ask whether any living thing understands it. It simply goes. Most people on Earth did not witness these particular floods. Many lived far away, in warmer lands, on coasts, in forests, beside rivers whose names are lost. But the planet is connected. Ice melting in one region raises seas everywhere. Fresh water entering the ocean can alter climate far away. A stormier coast in one generation can become a drowned homeland in another. The disaster at the end of the Ice Age was not one wave sweeping the globe in a single day. It was a long age of rising water, broken ice, unstable weather, migration, adaptation, and grief. This is why the number 400 feet matters. 400 feet of sea level rise does not sound like a story when spoken as a measurement. It sounds technical, distant, almost clean. But imagine it as a staircase. Imagine the ocean climbing one step, then another, not for years, but for millennia. Each generation says the water is a little closer than it was in the stories of the grandparents. A fishing place becomes too deep. A path becomes a channel. An island is born from a hilltop. A sacred grove becomes a reef. The bones of ancestors lie beneath tides that no child can cross. There were moments when the climb was faster. Scientists have identified periods known as meltwater pulses, when sea level rose more rapidly than usual. One of the most dramatic, often called meltwater pulse 1A, occurred around 14,600 years ago. During such times, the sea may have risen quickly enough for people to notice within a lifetime, not as a single wall of water swallowing the world, but as a relentless taking. The sea would come farther during storms. Salt would enter freshwater places. Shorelines would collapse. People would move their camps, then move them again. And as they moved, they would carry stories. They would tell of the old land beyond the waves. They would tell of the time when the sea was far away. They would tell of a flood that came because the world changed, or because the spirits were angered, or because the sky opened, or because a great being broke a barrier that should not have been broken. They would tell the story in the language they had. Later generations would change it, shape it, ritualize it, and attach it to gods, kings, ancestors, mountains, and boats. But deep inside some of those stories, perhaps, there remained a memory of real water over real land. We must be careful here. Not every flood myth is a fossil of the Ice Age. Many flood stories come from river valleys, monsoons, tsunamis, storm surges, and local disasters. The flood stories of Mesopotamia, for example, were shaped in a land where the Tigris and Euphrates could bring both life and destruction. The stories of coastal peoples may remember storms as much as sea level rise. Myth is not a newspaper. It is memory transformed by meaning. And yet myths do not grow from nothing. They grow from fear, gratitude, trauma, landscape, and the deep human need to explain why the world is the way it is. If a people lives beside shells found high in the hills, they may imagine that water once covered everything. If they inherit a story of ancestors who came from a drowned land, they may preserve that memory in song. If they build their first villages near rivers that both feed and threaten them, they may come to believe that civilization itself exists only by the grace of controlled water. In this way, the end of the Ice Age may have helped create not only new coastlines, but new minds. It taught people that the earth could change. It taught them that home was not always permanent. It taught them to watch seasons, rivers, animals, clouds, tides, and stars with greater care. It may have pushed them into closer cooperation, because moving a group, storing food, defending new territory, or managing water requires social memory. It may have encouraged settlement where resources were reliable, and eventually farming where wild abundance was no longer enough. So when we begin this story, we begin not with a single flood, but with a world under pressure, ice pressing down on continents, water pressing against ice dams, sea pressing against low shores, cold pressing against life, hunger pressing against human imagination, and memory pressing forward from mouth to mouth, from fire to fire, across thousands of years. The people of that world did not know they were living at the edge of an age. No one told them that the Pleistocene was ending, that the Holocene was waiting, that the map of Earth was about to be redrawn. They woke, hunted, gathered, loved, mourned, taught their children, and watched the weather. Like us, they lived inside history without seeing its full shape. But the ice was melting. Far to the north, blue rivers ran across white plains. Beneath glaciers, hidden water carved tunnels. In the basins of future seas, the land waited without knowing it was doomed. Along the coasts, people slept beside fires under stars that seemed eternal. And somewhere, perhaps on a shore now lost beneath the North Sea, an old storyteller looked toward the dark line of the horizon and noticed that the water had come closer than before. For a long time, the change was quiet enough to hide inside ordinary days. A hunter might notice that the spring thaw came earlier than it had in childhood. A grandmother might remember winters when the river stayed sealed with ice longer into the season. A child might grow up hearing that, beyond the far marsh, there had once been dry ground where people gathered roots and trapped birds. No single morning announced the end of the Ice Age. No trumpet sounded across the plains. The world simply began to loosen. Snow withdrew from the lowlands. Glaciers darkened at their edges. Meltwater ran in silver threads across the surface of the ice, slipping into blue cracks and vanishing into the frozen depths below. The ice sheets, which had seemed as permanent as mountains, began to breathe, and every breath became water. To understand the terror and wonder of this age, we must first imagine the scale of what was melting. The northern ice sheets were not only frozen surfaces, they were towers of compressed time, made from countless storms, countless winters, countless snowfalls that had survived summer after summer until they turned to firn, then to dense glacial ice. In some places, they were miles thick. Under their weight, the land itself had bent downward. Valleys were buried, hills disappeared, ancient river systems were blocked or redirected. The ice did not merely sit on the world, it ruled the shape of the world. Then the climate shifted. More sunlight reached the high northern latitudes during summer because of natural changes in Earth's orbit and tilt. Greenhouse gases rose after the coldest part of the Ice Age. Ocean and atmosphere began passing warmth through the planet in new ways. The change was uneven, with advances and retreats, pauses and sudden leaps, but the overall direction was clear. The grip of ice was weakening. In the far north, the white margins pulled back from lands that had not seen plants for tens of thousands of years. First came bare mud and gravel, raw as a wound. Then came lichens, mosses, sedges, dwarf shrubs, and eventually young forests. Animals followed these green openings. Reindeer moved along the new edges of habitat. Birds returned to wetlands. Rivers, swollen with meltwater, carried fine glacial flour that turned them pale and milky under the sun. Human beings, patient and observant, followed too. They knew that changing land could be dangerous, but they also knew that new land meant new food. Where ice had retreated, there might be fresh routes, new stone sources, new hunting grounds, and rivers alive with fish. Yet every gift from the melting ice carried a hidden cost. Water that left the glaciers had to go somewhere. Some of it ran to the oceans, raising seas around the entire world. Some pooled in front of the ice sheets, trapped by high ground, frozen barriers, or the ice itself. These glacial lakes could be beautiful beyond imagining, wide, cold mirrors beneath pale skies. But they were temporary creatures. Their shores were unstable. Their dams were vulnerable. Their depths held pressure. They waited, sometimes for centuries, until a weakness opened. A crack, a tunnel, a warm season, a shift in the ice, and then the lake could become a flood. To the people of that age, such forces were not scientific diagrams. They were sounds in the night. They were rivers that rose without rain. They were valleys that could not be crossed anymore. They were the disappearance of familiar places. Think of a band of families living along a low coast during the early warming. Their world is rich. The sea, still lower than ours, lies beyond tidal flats and marshes. There are shellfish in the shallows, fish in the channels, eggs in the reeds, berries in the season, and animals drawn to the water's edge. The people have learned this place with the intimacy that only generations can create. They know which sandbanks are safe at low tide. They know where storms pile driftwood. They know the freshwater pools that remain sweet even near the shore. They know where their dead lie, perhaps on a rise above the marsh, wrapped with care, accompanied by tools, ochre, beads, or flowers that left no trace. Then, over a lifetime, the balance changes. The highest tides reach farther inland. Salt enters pools once used for drinking. Storms cut into the bank. A burial place begins to collapse into the water. The people move their camp higher. At first, it seems enough. Then their children move higher again. The sea does not need to rush in like a monster to destroy a world. Sometimes it only needs to keep arriving. This is one of the most haunting truths of the end of the Ice Age. The catastrophe was both sudden and slow. In some places, floods may have struck with unimaginable speed, bursting from lakes and racing across landscapes in days. In other places, the disaster unfolded across generations, too gradual to be called a single event, yet too relentless to escape. Sea level rise became a kind of background pressure on human history. At the low point of the Ice Age, coastlines were far beyond the shores we know today. As the ice melted, the oceans climbed upward by hundreds of feet. The rise was not perfectly steady. There were intervals when the sea moved faster, and these faster intervals may have been unforgettable. One of the most dramatic episodes, known to researchers as Meltwater Pulse 1A, occurred around 14,600 years ago. During that pulse, sea level appears to have risen very rapidly by geological standards, perhaps many feet within a few human generations. The exact sources of that meltwater remain debated, but its meaning for coastal people is easier to imagine. A world already changing began changing faster. A shoreline once stable enough to name became a moving boundary. A place where grandparents had hunted became a lagoon. A lagoon became open water. A hill became an island. An island became a reef. Stories that began as memory became warning. Do not build too close to the low shore. Do not trust the quiet water. Do not forget the old land beneath the waves. In Europe, the land that we call Doggerland was one of these worlds caught between ice and sea. During the Cold Age, it had been part of a broad plain connecting Britain to the continent. It was not a blank bridge, but a living landscape with rivers, wetlands, animals, and likely human communities moving through it. As the sea rose, Doggerland shrank. Its lowlands became marshes and islands. Its rivers widened under tidal influence. Its people, if they lived there in lasting numbers, would have watched their world fracture piece by piece. To stand in eastern Britain today and look toward the North Sea is to look across a graveyard of landscapes. Beneath the water lie old valleys, peat beds, tree stumps, animal bones, and stone tools. The sea that now separates Britain from mainland Europe was once land remembered by feet. In Southeast Asia, the drowning of Sundaland was even more vast. During the Ice Age low sea stand, much of the shallow Sunda shelf was exposed, linking areas that are now divided among islands and peninsulas. Tropical forests, river systems, savannas, mangroves, and coastlines shifted again and again as water rose. Human communities in this region were already skilled travelers through complex environments. Some may have used boats or rafts to move across channels. As the sea advanced, people did not simply vanish. They adapted, migrated, climbed into highlands, followed coasts, and carried languages, tools, plants, animals, and stories with them. The modern island world of Southeast Asia may preserve, in its deep cultural memory, the feeling of a land broken by water. Again, we must speak carefully. We cannot point to one myth and declare with certainty that it is the direct memory of one drowned valley. But we can say that the physical transformation was real. Land became sea. Connected worlds became islands. Human beings experienced that change not as a map, but as hunger, movement, loss, and awe. The same was true in many regions now hidden below shallow continental shelves. The Persian Gulf, for example, was once a low basin with river systems before rising seas filled it. Parts of the Adriatic, the Yellow Sea, the Gulf of Thailand, the Arafura Shelf, and many other coastal plains were exposed during the Cold Age and later drowned. Around the world, some of the most attractive places for human life were also the places most vulnerable to the returning ocean. This has enormous importance for how we imagine prehistory. For more than a century, people searched for the origins of civilization, mostly on land, in river valleys and dry sites where stone, bone, and architecture survived. But if early communities often favored coasts and estuaries, then many traces of their lives may now lie underwater. The missing evidence is not necessarily evidence that nothing existed. It may only mean that the ocean keeps its archives in darkness. Underwater archaeology has begun to reveal fragments of these lost landscapes, but the work is difficult. Sediment covers sites, currents scatter remains, organic materials decay. Modern seas are busy with fishing, shipping, storms, and industrial activity. Still, every submerged forest and every drowned tool reminds us that the human past was larger than the land we see. As the ice breathed out water, it also changed the sky. Fresh water pouring into the oceans could influence circulation. Melting ice altered the reflectivity of Earth's surface, because dark land and water absorb more sunlight than snow and ice. Vegetation shifted, dust patterns changed, and weather systems reorganized. People living then may have experienced not only rising seas, but changing rainfall, shifting animal migrations, and unfamiliar seasons. A world of inherited knowledge became less predictable. That is one of the deepest human consequences of rapid environmental change. People survive by memory. They survive because elders know when salmon run, when plants ripen, where animals cross, how clouds behave before storms, which springs last through drought, and where ice is safe. When climate changes quickly, old memory does not become useless, but it becomes uncertain. The old signs may still speak, but they speak in broken sentences. Imagine an elder who has guided the group for decades, suddenly unsure whether the herd will return to the same valley. Imagine young hunters questioning whether the old route is still wise. Imagine a mother walking farther each year for fresh water because salt has entered the low pools. Such pressures do not need to destroy a people in order to transform them. They encourage experiment. They reward flexibility. They make movement, storage, cooperation, and planning more valuable. They may even change the spiritual imagination. In a stable landscape, the sacred may live in familiar stones, trees, springs, and hills. In a drowning landscape, the sacred may become more restless. Spirits may move with water. Ancestors may live beneath the sea. Mountains may become places of rescue. Boats may become symbols of survival. Flood stories may begin not only as accounts of destruction, but as maps of meaning for people whose world no longer stays still. The melting earth also created a strange emotional rhythm. Terror mixed with abundance. Retreating glaciers released new rivers and lakes. Warmer climates opened forests and wetlands. Fish, birds, and plants could flourish in the new conditions. For some communities, the end of the Ice Age may have felt like opportunity. For others, it may have felt like exile. Often, it was probably both. A family leaving a drowned coast might discover a fertile river valley inland. A group pushed from old hunting grounds might learn to harvest grains more carefully. Communities meeting along new migration routes might exchange tools, mates, stories, and rituals. Disaster can scatter people, but it can also connect them. It can carry ideas across landscapes with the urgency of need. This may be one reason the centuries after the Ice Age were so fertile in human transformation. Not because climate change magically created civilization, but because unstable environments forced human beings to become more deliberate about food, water, settlement, and memory. In the Near East, as wild grains became important and some communities settled for longer periods, people began building heavier houses, storing food, and reshaping their surroundings. In other regions, people developed new fishing strategies, watercraft traditions, coastal adaptations, or seasonal movements. The world after the ice was not a single road toward farming. It was 1,000 experiments. Some ended, some continued, some became the foundations of villages, towns, temples, canals, and states. And beneath many of them was the same ancient lesson. Water gives life, and water takes it away. As evening falls over our imagined Ice Age shore, the family gathers near a fire. The air smells of smoke, wet reeds, and salt. Far out on the flats, the tide is coming in. The old storyteller watches it with narrowed eyes. He remembers when that line of water stopped farther away. He remembers a path across the marsh that no one uses now. He remembers a place where his mother once dug roots, now covered even when the tide is low. Around him, children lean against their parents, half listening, half dreaming. He begins to speak, not in the language of science, not in measurements of feet or years, but in the language human beings have always used when the world becomes too large to hold in the mind. He tells of the time when the water was sleeping. He tells of the day it woke. He tells them that the land beneath the waves is not gone completely, because those who remember it carry it inside them. Above the fire, sparks rise into the dark. Beyond the shore, the sea keeps climbing. Far to the north, the ice continues to melt. And in the deep places behind the glaciers, enormous lakes are growing, waiting for the moment when their frozen walls will fail. Just when the world seemed to be warming, just when the ice appeared to be losing its ancient throne, the cold came back. It returned like a memory the earth could not release, like winter rising from the grave of winter itself. Around 12,900 years ago, after centuries of warming had opened forests, filled rivers, lifted seas, and drawn people into new lands, much of the northern hemisphere suddenly slipped back toward glacial conditions. The change was not gentle. In some places, temperatures fell sharply within a human lifetime, perhaps even within decades. Forests retreated, tundra plants returned, winds strengthened, dust moved across open ground. The animals changed their paths, and the people who followed them had to learn the world all over again. Scientists call this cold interval the Younger Dryas, named after a small white Arctic flower whose pollen appears in ancient sediments from that time. The flower is delicate, with pale petals and a golden center, but the age that bears its name was anything but delicate. It lasted for roughly 1,200 years, long enough to swallow the lives of 40 or 50 generations. To us, it is a climate event. To those who lived through it, it was the shape of existence. No one woke one morning and said that the Younger Dryas had begun. They only knew that something was wrong with the seasons. The old warmth did not return as expected. Spring came late. Plants that had begun to spread into the north faltered. Ice lingered longer on lakes. Snow survived in shaded hollows. The herds moved differently, perhaps searching for grazing that had shifted with the cold. People who had recently adapted to a milder world now faced the cruel uncertainty of reversal. Imagine a settlement near the edge of a woodland where generations had watched birch and pine creep across the land after the retreat of the glaciers. The young trees had been a promise. They meant fuel, shelter poles, animals, birds, nuts, berries, and shade beside the streams. Then the promise weakened. The trees stopped advancing. Some died back. Open ground returned. The people looked at the sky and felt the old cold pressing down again, though many of them had never known the deepest ice age. Their grandparents had told stories of a harsher world, and now those stories no longer sounded distant. They sounded like warnings. The cause of the younger Dryas remains one of the great mysteries of paleoclimate science. A leading explanation points toward fresh water. As the ice sheets melted, vast lakes formed along their margins. These lakes were not peaceful ornaments on the land. They were enormous reservoirs of cold fresh water, held in place by ice dams, ridges, and shifting outlets. If enough of this fresh water escaped into the North Atlantic or Arctic systems, it could have interfered with ocean circulation. The ocean moves heat around the planet through a complex pattern of currents shaped by temperature and salt. Warm surface water flows northward. In the far North Atlantic, that water cools, becomes dense, and sinks, helping to drive a global circulation sometimes compared to a conveyor belt. But fresh water is lighter than salty water. Pour a great volume of cold fresh water into the Northern Ocean, and the sinking can weaken. The movement of heat can slow. The North can cool, even while the world as a whole is moving out of an ice age. This explanation is powerful because it shows how connected Earth truly is. A lake breaking free in North America might influence weather far across the Atlantic. Meltwater from an ice sheet might change winds, rainfall, vegetation, and human survival thousands of miles away. Yet the full story is still debated. Some researchers have explored other possibilities, including changes in atmospheric circulation, ice sheet dynamics, and even the controversial idea of a cosmic impact or air burst at the beginning of the Younger Dryas. That impact hypothesis remains disputed, and it should be treated with caution. But the debate itself reminds us how dramatic the transition was. Something happened that left a strong signal in ice cores, sediments, pollen records, and landscapes. The Earth, warming toward a new age, suddenly stumbled backward into cold. For human beings, the Younger Dryas was not only a climate shift, it was a test of memory, mobility, and imagination. People had always lived with change, but this was change layered upon change. The ice had begun to withdraw, then the cold returned. The seas were rising, yet some regions became harsher. Rivers swelled with meltwater, but rainfall patterns could fail or move. Familiar combinations of plants and animals broke apart. A valley that had supported one way of life might no longer support it. A coast that had offered abundance might be shrinking. A hunting route might become unreliable. A gathering ground might dry out, freeze, or flood. In such a world, the most important human skill may not have been strength or speed, but attention. To survive, people had to notice everything: the timing of birds, the thickness of ice, the flowering of plants, the taste of water, the behavior of animals, the direction of storms, the stories of travelers, the memories of elders. Every sign mattered because the world was speaking in changes. Let us follow for a while a small group moving through this uncertain age. They are not farmers yet, at least not in the way we would later understand farming. They gather wild grains when the season allows. They hunt gazelle, deer, wild cattle, or smaller animals depending on the region. They collect nuts, roots, fruits, and seeds. They know the places where water remains in dry months. They return to certain camps because those camps are tied to food, stone, ancestors, and stories. For several generations, perhaps, they have stayed longer in one place than their older ancestors did. Their huts are semi-permanent. Their dead are buried nearby. Their children know the settlement as home. Then the cold and dryness deepen. Wild grain stands become less dependable. Game patterns change. The group faces a choice that is not made in one meeting, but across years. Move more often, as older peoples had done, or become more involved in shaping the plants they need. Harvest more carefully, save seed, clear competing plants, return to the same stands, protect them, scatter seeds near camp, watch what grows. None of this begins as farming with a name. It begins as care. It begins as hunger, remembering where food came from. In the lands of the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East, the younger Dryas may have intensified pressures that contributed to the long transition toward agriculture. This was not a simple story where cold weather invented farming. Human choices are more complex than that. People experimented, abandoned experiments, returned to older ways, and tried again. But climate stress can narrow the path. When wild resources become unpredictable, storage becomes more valuable. When storage becomes valuable, settled life becomes more attractive. When settlements become more permanent, people become more invested in nearby plants, water, walls, and social rules. In this way, the cold return may have helped nudge some communities toward the world of cultivation, not by command, but by necessity. Elsewhere, the younger Dryas shaped lives differently. In Europe, reindeer hunters moved through cold, open landscapes, following herds across seasonal ranges. In North America, people adapted to changing animal communities at the end of the Pleistocene, a time when many large mammals were vanishing. The causes of those extinctions remain debated, involving climate change, habitat transformation, human hunting pressure, and complex ecological cascades. For people living then, the disappearance of great animals would have been more than a change in diet. It would have altered stories, rituals, tools, routes, and identities. If your grandparents had followed mammoth herds and your grandchildren never saw one, the world had not merely changed. It had lost a presence. The younger Dryas also existed in the shadow of water. Even during this cold interval, the larger deglacial process continued in complicated ways. Ice remained unstable. Glacial lakes grew and shifted. Coasts remained vulnerable. Sea level did not simply stop forever. The cold return may have slowed some melting, but it did not restore the old world. Instead, it created a strange double reality. Cold winds over a planet still moving toward higher seas. Imagine standing near a northern river during the younger Dryas. The air is bitter. The ground is open and treeless. Yet beyond the horizon, ice margins are changing. Lakes are pressing against barriers, and the ocean waits for more meltwater. The old ice age is dying, but it dies in convulsions. This is perhaps why the younger Dryas feels so important in any story of ancient floods. It is the pause before a new surge, the backward glance before the final turning. It marks a period when climate proved that it could change abruptly, not only over thousands of years, but within the scale of human memory. A child could grow up in one kind of world and die in another. A story told by an elder could describe conditions that young listeners had never seen, but might soon see again. Such instability is the soil in which powerful myths grow. Myths often preserve emotional truth, even when their details shift. A culture may not remember a precise meltwater pulse or a named climate interval, but it may remember that the world once became untrustworthy. It may remember that water came where land had been. It may remember that cold, hunger, and migration followed the breaking of old boundaries. It may remember that survival depended on warnings, vessels, mountains, chosen families, or sacred instructions. In many flood traditions, the disaster is not random. Someone is warned, someone builds, someone preserves seeds, animals, knowledge, or law. After the waters fall, the survivors begin again. These themes may speak to a universal human experience of catastrophe, but they also resonate deeply with the world at the end of the Ice Age. People were not passive victims. They prepared, they moved, they remembered. They carried fire, tools, children, stories, and sometimes seeds into the future. In a slow documentary of the mind, the younger Dryas is not a single scene, but a long, dim passage. We move through it by starlight. We hear wind over dry grass. We see a family wrapped in hides walking along the edge of a frozen marsh. We see another group gathered inside a circular hut, sorting seeds by firelight while outside the night grows cold. We see hunters studying tracks in snow. We see a child touching a carved animal pendant and asking why no one sees that animal anymore. We see elders looking toward mountains where glaciers shine under the moon. Above them, the sky is brilliant, vast, and indifferent. Beneath them, the ground holds the seeds of a new age. What makes the younger Dryas haunting is that it was temporary, but not brief. After about 1,200 years, the cold period ended abruptly. Around 11,700 years ago, temperatures rose again, marking the beginning of the Holocene, the warm interval in which all recorded civilization would eventually unfold. In some ice core records, the shift out of the younger Dryas appears remarkably rapid. The Earth did not slowly wake this time. It seemed in certain regions to turn suddenly toward warmth. Forests expanded, ice retreated farther, sea level continued to rise, rivers changed again. Human communities entered a world that was warmer, wetter in some places, drier in others, and increasingly favorable to new forms of settlement. The Holocene would become the age of farming, villages, pottery, temples, cities, writing, kings, laws, trade, and memory carved into stone. But it was born from instability. It rose from the ruins of cold and flood. It was not a peaceful dawn after a quiet night. It was morning after a storm that had lasted longer than any kingdom. If we listen carefully, we can hear the emotional echo of that transition. The cold returns, then leaves. The water rises, then rises again. The animals disappear or move away. The old shore is lost. The new valley becomes home. The first fields are tended. The first granaries fill. The first walls rise. The first rituals ask the sky and water to be merciful. Human beings begin to believe, perhaps more strongly than ever before, that survival depends on remembering disaster. This belief would follow us into civilization. In Mesopotamia, people built cities between rivers that could flood with life-giving silt or devastating force. In Egypt, the Nile's flood became the rhythm of order itself. In the Indus Valley, settlements were shaped by water management and shifting rivers. In China, flood control became a foundation of legendary kingship. Again and again, civilization appears beside water, and again, it defines itself by learning to live with water's danger. Behind those later achievements stands the older, colder lesson of the deglacial world. Nature is not fixed. The boundary between land and sea can move. The climate can turn. The world can be remade. Near the end of the Younger Dryas, imagine one final winter in a northern camp. Snow lies thin across the ground. The people sleep close together, their breath rising in the darkness. Outside, the frozen river creaks under the moon. An old woman wakes before dawn and steps from the shelter. She has lived long enough to hear stories from those who remembered warmer times, and she has spent most of her life inside the cold return. She looks toward the east. The horizon is still dark, but something in the air has changed. The wind is softer. Somewhere beneath the ice, water is moving. Somewhere far away, a lake is pressing against its dam. Somewhere beyond sight, the ocean is preparing to climb. The old woman does not know that an epoch is ending. She does not know that future scholars will give this age a name. She only knows that the world has never stayed still, and that every generation must learn again how to live upon it. As the first light touches the frozen grass, she turns back toward the fire. Behind her, the cold age begins, slowly and invisibly, to release its hold. Ahead, the waters wait. There are floods that arrive from the sky, falling as rain until rivers swell beyond their banks. There are floods that arrive from the sea, driven inland by storms, earthquakes, and waves. And then there are floods born from ice, floods so large that they seem less like weather and more like the movement of a broken planet. At the end of the Ice Age, as the great glaciers retreated, the northern world became a landscape of imprisoned water. Vast lakes formed where no lakes had been before, filling basins carved by ice, blocked by ice, and bordered by land still rising from beneath the weight of vanished glaciers. These lakes were temporary kingdoms. Some lasted for centuries. Some changed shape again and again. Some were larger than modern seas. Their surfaces may have looked calm beneath the pale sun, but their existence depended on fragile barriers, ridges of sediment, frozen walls, tongues of glacier, and outlets that could open, close, and fail. When they failed, the water did not simply flow away. It attacked the world. To stand near one of these lakes before the breaking would have been to stand beside a sleeping giant. Imagine a cold inland sea stretching beyond sight, its water gray, still, and bitter. On one side stands an ice dam, blue in its cracks and white on its wind-polished face. Meltwater trickles at its base. In summer, streams run across the ice and disappear into holes that plunge downward through the glacier. At night, the ice groans. Sometimes it cracks like distant thunder. Birds cry over the shore. Driftwood gathers in coves. Animals come to drink, wary of the unstable ground. A human group passing nearby might admire the lake, fear it, or avoid it. They would not know the pressures hidden beneath its surface, but they might sense danger in the sound of moving ice. Among the most famous of these glacial lakes was Lake Missoula in what is now western Montana. It formed when a lobe of the Cordilleran ice sheet blocked the Clark Fork River, creating an enormous lake behind the ice. The dam was not stone. It was glacier, immense and powerful, but vulnerable to its own nature. As the lake deepened, pressure increased against the ice barrier. Water may have lifted, fractured, or tunneled through the dam. Once a passage opened, the escaping water enlarged it with terrifying speed. The lake began to drain, not as a stream, but as a force almost beyond imagination. A wall of water surged westward through valleys, across what is now Idaho and Washington, toward the Columbia River system and the Pacific. This did not happen only once. Evidence suggests that Lake Missoula filled and drained many times over thousands of years, each flood leaving marks on the land. These floods helped carve the channeled scablands, one of the strangest landscapes in North America, a region of dry channels, coulees, cataract cliffs, gravel bars, and stripped bedrock. To see it today is to see the skeleton of water after the water is gone. Long before modern geology understood it, the landscape seemed almost impossible. There were giant ripple marks too large for ordinary rivers, boulders carried far from their sources, and channels carved on a scale that suggested violence. The geologist J. Harlan Bretz argued in the 20th century that catastrophic floods had shaped the scablands, a claim once controversial because many scientists preferred slow, gradual explanations. Over time, the evidence became overwhelming. The land itself had been written in flood. Picture one of those Missoula floods at its height. The ice dam fails. The lake begins to fall. Water races through a widening breach, carrying ice blocks, trees, sediment, stones, and anything living in its path. Downstream, valleys fill from wall to wall. The flood is deep enough to drown hills. It moves with such power that it can rip away soil, quarry basalt, and roll boulders as if they were pebbles. Where the flood spreads out, it leaves enormous bars of gravel. Where it narrows, it cuts deep channels. Where it pours over cliffs, waterfalls larger than any known today thunder across the land. The noise would have been continuous, a roar so complete that it would erase all other sound. For any human being close enough to witness it, the experience would have seemed like the unmaking of creation. Farther east, another giant was growing. Lake Agassiz. This vast glacial lake formed along the southern edge of the Laurentide ice sheet and at different times covered large parts of what are now Manitoba, Ontario, Saskatchewan, North Dakota, and Minnesota. It was not a simple lake with one stable shoreline. It changed as the ice retreated, as outlets opened and closed, and as the land rebounded from the pressure of ice. At its greatest extent, Lake Agassiz was enormous, larger than all the modern Great Lakes combined in some reconstructions. Its waters occupied a shifting basin of cold immensity, bordered by ice to the north and open land to the south. The lake drained through different routes at different times. Sometimes its waters flowed southward through river systems toward the Mississippi and the Gulf of Mexico. At other times, outlets may have sent fresh water eastward or northward. These drainage changes matter because Lake Agassiz was large enough to influence more than regional landscapes. If vast amounts of fresh water entered the North Atlantic or Arctic oceans, they could have affected ocean circulation and climate. This is why Lake Agassiz often appears in discussions of the Younger Dryas and other abrupt climate events. It may have been one of the great levers by which melting ice disturbed the atmosphere and ocean. Again, the precise timing and pathways remain subjects of research and debate, but the basic fact is clear. North America held a body of meltwater so large that its release could help change the world. To imagine Lake Agassiz only as a scientific object is to miss its dark beauty. Think of standing on its ancient shore at dusk. The lake stretches flat and cold to the horizon, a gray mirror beneath a sky of violet clouds. Icebergs drift in the distance where glacier fronts calve into water. The shore is muddy, marked by animal tracks and the prints of birds. The air smells of wet stone, cold silt, and ice. Somewhere beyond the visible edge, a barrier controls the level of the water. If that barrier changes, the shoreline where you stand may be abandoned. The lake may drop suddenly, leaving stranded fish, empty mudflats, and new river channels. Or it may rise, swallowing low ground and forcing every living thing to move. For people near such lakes, the danger was not abstract. Rivers downstream of glacial outbursts could rise with little warning. A valley could become a torrent. Camps placed near water for food and travel could become traps. Yet these landscapes also attracted life. Glacial lakes and their outlets supported fish, birds, plants, and animals. People would have come to them because water gathers abundance. That is the ancient bargain. The richest places are often the most dangerous. In the American Northwest, repeated Missoula floods shaped not only geology, but the later possibilities of life. They stripped some areas bare and left deep sediments in others. They changed drainage patterns, carved coulees, and created temporary lakes where floodwaters backed up behind constrictions. In the vast basin of Lake Agassiz, the legacy includes fertile soils, lake plains, beaches, and landforms that still shape agriculture and settlement today. The catastrophes of the Ice Age did not vanish after the water drained. They remained in the ground beneath farms, towns, roads, and forests. They became the hidden architecture of modern life. Glacial outburst floods were not limited to North America. Across the deglaciating world, ice dams failed, lakes drained, and rivers carried sudden pulses of water and sediment. In Iceland, Greenland, the Himalayas, the Alps, and other glaciated regions, smaller but still dangerous outburst floods have occurred in historical and modern times. The Icelandic word jökulhlaup is often used for such floods, especially those released from glaciers by volcanic or geothermal activity. These modern examples help us imagine the ancient ones, though the Ice Age events in North America could reach scales that dwarf ordinary experience. A jökulhlaup shows the principle: water trapped by ice can become a weapon when released. At the end of the Ice Age, the planet was full of such weapons. The human mind, living close to danger, would have learned to respect signs of sudden water. A lake that drains overnight. A river that rises without rain. A roar from a valley before the flood arrives. Fish left dying on new mud. Trees torn and piled in tangled walls. Boulders placed where no ordinary stream could have carried them. These are the kinds of sights that become stories. In an oral culture, a story is not entertainment alone. It is a survival tool. It tells children where not to sleep, when to climb, which waters cannot be trusted, and why the old people watch the river even under a clear sky. Over time, the practical warning may become sacred. The flood came because someone broke a law. The flood came because a spirit was angry. The flood came because the world had grown corrupt. The flood came because a great barrier in the north was opened. The details vary, but the emotional truth remains. Water can arrive from beyond human expectation and erase the known world. The scale of glacial floods also forces us to think differently about catastrophe. Modern people often imagine disaster as an event with a beginning and an end. The earthquake strikes, the storm passes, the river recedes, but the glacial catastrophe could be rhythmic. Lake Missoula filled and failed many times. Sea level rose in pulses. Ice retreated, paused, and retreated again. Climate warmed, cooled, and warmed again. For communities living through these centuries, disaster may have become part of the pattern of the world. Not constant panic, but recurring instability. The elders could say, "It happened before." The young could ask, "Will it happen again?" In that question lies the beginning of both science and myth. Science watches for pattern. Myth gives pattern a face. Imagine a group camped on high ground after fleeing a flood valley. Below them, water spreads where grassland had been. Trees turn in the current. The night is cold. Children cry from hunger and fear. The adults count who survived. Someone has lost a brother. Someone has lost a bundle of tools. Someone has lost the place where an ancestor was buried. In the darkness, the oldest man begins to speak. He does not have measurements. He does not know cubic miles of water, ice sheet dynamics, or ocean circulation. But he knows that a wall broke in the world. He knows the river became a sky-colored beast. He knows that only those who climbed survived. He tells the children to remember the high places. He tells them the water has a voice before it comes. He tells them to listen. This is how catastrophe becomes inheritance. Not all inheritance is carried in objects. Much of it is carried in fear, carefully shaped into instruction. When we later read flood legends from ancient civilizations, we often meet kings, gods, boats, mountains, birds, and covenants. These are the literary forms of cultures that had already become complex. But behind such forms may stand older experiences. Campfires, sudden rivers, broken ice, lost coasts, and the deep human need to make disaster meaningful. The glacial floods gave the earth a terrifying vocabulary. They taught that a barrier can fail. They taught that water stored far away can destroy places downstream. They taught that what seems solid, even ice like a mountain, can open. They taught that survival depends on paying attention before the flood arrives. These lessons would echo long after the glaciers withdrew. In later river civilizations, people watched floods with ritual and calculation. They built embankments, canals, storage systems, and calendars. They assigned divine power to rivers because rivers deserved it. They understood, in ways both practical and sacred, that civilization is a conversation with water. Perhaps the oldest chapters of that conversation were spoken beside glacial lakes. By the end of the Younger Dryas and the dawn of the Holocene, many of the greatest ice dams were weakening or gone, but their consequences remained. The oceans continued to rise. Former lake beds became plains. Flood-carved landscapes began to green. Human groups moved through regions remade by water, sometimes unaware of the full violence that had shaped the ground beneath them. A child picking berries in a quiet coulee could not know that a flood once roared there deeper than a tower. A family crossing a dry gravel bar could not know that it had been built by waters powerful enough to move mountains piece by piece. Yet perhaps some stories remained. Perhaps a hill had a name, meaning place of refuge. Perhaps a cliff was said to have been cut by angry water. Perhaps a valley was avoided when the river sounded strange. The land kept memory in stone, and humans kept memory in speech. Tonight, as we drift through this ancient world, the glacial lakes lie under moonlight. Lake Missoula is dark behind its dam of ice. Lake Agassiz stretches beneath stars that shimmer in the cold air. Along their shores, animals sleep uneasily. Humans tend small fires. The ice cracks. Water moves in hidden tunnels. Pressure gathers without hurry. Nothing seems to happen for a long time. Then, somewhere in the blue heart of the glacier, a passage opens. The lake begins to breathe out. The ground trembles. The sleeping giant wakes, and the water starts its journey toward the sea. Long after the great glacial lakes broke their walls and carved their scars into the continents, another kind of flood continued its quieter work. This flood did not always roar through valleys. It did not always arrive as a single wave or announce itself with thunder. It came with tides, seasons, storms, and centuries. It crept over mudflats. It filled river mouths. It turned forests into marshes, marshes into lagoons, lagoons into open sea. It separated hills from plains and made them islands. It erased camps, paths, graves, hunting grounds, and gathering places. It redrew the map of the human world so completely that later generations would forget there had ever been land where the waves now moved. The sea was rising. Around the world, as the ice sheets melted, the oceans climbed from their ice age low point by roughly 400 feet. For the Earth, this was a geological transition. For human beings, it was the slow drowning of home. Today, when we look at a coastline, we often think of it as permanent. We build cities, ports, temples, roads, and memories along the edge of the water as though that edge has always been there. But coastlines are restless borders. They breathe with ice ages. When the planet freezes and glaciers grow, the sea falls and exposes broad continental shelves. When the planet warms and ice melts, the sea returns, taking back those shelves in mile after mile of advancing water. At the end of the last ice age, some of the most habitable lands on Earth were caught in that return. These were not minor strips of beach. They were countries without names, regions large enough to hold rivers, forests, animals, and human cultures. Many of them are now hidden beneath shallow seas. Their memory survives only in drowned tree stumps, submerged peat, ancient shorelines, stone tools brought up by fishing nets, and the myths of lands lost beneath the waves. One of the most haunting of these lost regions is Doggerland. Today, the North Sea lies between Britain and continental Europe, gray, cold, and crossed by ships. But during the Ice Age, when sea level was much lower, that basin was a broad plain. Rivers flowed through it. Herds grazed across it. Wetlands spread in its low places. People likely hunted, camped, traveled, and perhaps lived seasonally there for thousands of years. Britain was not yet an island. It was a western extension of Europe, connected by land over which animals and humans could pass. If you could stand there 12,000 years ago, you might see a wide sky over open country, the distant shimmer of water channels, birds rising from reeds, red deer moving through willow scrub, and smoke from a small human fire drifting in the evening air. The land would not know it was doomed. As the Holocene warmth took hold and the sea rose, Doggerland began to shrink. Its rivers became tidal. Salt water pushed inland. Low areas flooded. What had once been open country became a landscape of marshes, channels, and islands. People may have adapted for a time, taking advantage of rich wetlands full of fish, birds, and plants. But the sea kept climbing. Storms reached farther. The old land broke apart. By around 8,000 years ago, much of Doggerland had disappeared beneath the North Sea. A later submarine landslide off the coast of Norway, known as the Storegga Slide, produced a tsunami that may have struck the remaining low islands and coasts of the region. Whether it finished the last remnants of Doggerland or merely devastated communities already living on its shrinking edges, the image is powerful. A world already being swallowed by the sea struck by a sudden wall of water from the north. For those who survived, the transformation of Britain into an island may not have been an abstract geographical event. It may have been remembered as the loss of a road, the loss of kinship roots, the loss of a plain where ancestors once hunted. Another drowned world lay far to the southeast under warmer skies. Sundaland was the vast exposed continental shelf that once connected much of mainland Southeast Asia with what are now the islands of Sumatra, Java, Borneo, and surrounding lands. During lower sea levels, rivers crossed this larger landmass, including systems that no longer exist above water. Tropical forests, grasslands, mangroves, and coastal habitats shifted as climate and sea level changed. For human communities, Sundaland would have been a place of extraordinary richness and complexity. It stood at the meeting of land and sea, forest and river, island and continent. People there may have moved through dense environments, gathered plants, hunted animals, harvested coastal resources, and traveled by water long before the modern map took shape. Then the ocean came back. Unlike Doggerland, Sundaland drowned under tropical light. The rising sea filled low basins, widened channels, separated highlands, and created the island world we know today. Communities that had once moved across connected landscapes found themselves living on islands, peninsulas, and coasts that shifted generation by generation. Such a transformation would have encouraged movement, seafaring, adaptation, and perhaps the spread of stories about lands swallowed by the sea. It is tempting to imagine flood memories from this region carried outward with migrating peoples, woven into the deep mythologies of island Southeast Asia and the Pacific. We must not claim more certainty than evidence allows, but the geography itself invites wonder. When land is drowned on such a scale, human memory rarely remains untouched. In some places, the sea did not merely cover land, it divided worlds. Australia, New Guinea, and Tasmania had once been connected into the larger Ice Age landmass called Sahul. As sea level rose, the water separated Tasmania from mainland Australia and later divided New Guinea from Australia through the flooding of the lowlands that became Torres Strait. For the peoples of Sahul, who had lived there for tens of thousands of years, these were not just changes on a map. They were transformations of ancestral country. Some Aboriginal Australian traditions have been interpreted by researchers as preserving memories of sea level rise, describing places that were once dry land and later became sea. Such oral traditions are extraordinary because they may show how carefully human cultures can hold environmental memory across immense spans of time. In a world without writing, song, story, ritual, and place names can become vessels stronger than stone. They carry coastlines inside language long after the coastline itself has vanished. Farther west, another basin waited for the sea, the Persian Gulf. During the lower sea levels of the Ice Age, much of the modern Gulf was dry land, a low plain fed by rivers from surrounding regions. Some scholars have suggested that this basin may have offered a refuge for human groups during harsh climatic periods, with fresh water, plants, animals, and routes between Arabia, Mesopotamia, and Iran. As the sea rose in the early Holocene, it gradually flooded the basin, creating the Gulf we know today. If people lived on that plain, their settlements and camps would now lie underwater. Later civilizations in Mesopotamia would grow near rivers at the head of this marine world, telling stories of floods, primeval waters, and cities before catastrophe. We cannot simply identify one drowned landscape as the source of later myth, but we can feel how the geography might have shaped imagination. A people living near the edge of a newly formed sea may inherit older stories of land below the water, and such stories may deepen into sacred history. The Black Sea presents one of the most famous and debated examples of ancient flooding. At the end of the Ice Age, the Black Sea basin was different from today, and its connection to the Mediterranean changed as sea levels rose. In the 1990s, researchers William Ryan and Walter Pittman proposed that around 7,600 years ago, Mediterranean waters may have burst through the Bosporus into a lower freshwater Black Sea basin, causing a rapid and catastrophic rise in water level that could have displaced people and inspired flood legends. The idea captured public imagination because it seemed to offer a possible natural background for Near Eastern flood stories. Yet the Black Sea flood hypothesis remains debated. Other researchers argue for a more gradual reconnection, different water levels, or a more complex sequence of events. The truth may not be as simple as one sudden waterfall from the Mediterranean into the basin. Still, the Black Sea story is valuable because it shows how scientific evidence and ancient memory can circle each other, each asking what the other might contain. Even a gradual rise can be catastrophic to people who live on low shores. Even a disputed flood can remind us that basins, straits, and seas have histories far older than written maps. Across the planet, the same pattern repeated in different forms. The English Channel widened. The Adriatic flooded low plains. The Yellow Sea and East China Sea covered broad shelves. The Gulf of Thailand expanded over lands that had once connected coasts and river systems. The Arafura Shelf between Australia and New Guinea drowned. Beringia, the vast land connection between Siberia and Alaska, became fragmented as seas rose, eventually closing one of the great migration landscapes of the Ice Age. Every place had its own timing, its own ecology, its own human story. But the shared theme was unmistakable. The ocean returned and the world grew smaller. Imagine the psychological effect of that return. A community living along a low coast does not think in global sea level curves. It thinks in places. The place where the old woman collected shells. The place where the boys learned to spear fish. The place where a child was buried beneath red ochre. The place where a strange stone marked the meeting ground with another group. As water rises, each place is threatened in turn. At first, people shift slightly inland. Then they shift again. They adapt their diet, build new shelters, learn new channels, and teach children new dangers. But there comes a point when adaptation becomes departure. The old territory cannot be lived in as before. The people must move, and when they move, they carry grief in the form of story. The land beneath the sea becomes not only lost property, but lost identity. It becomes the before place, the ancestor place, the country of mist and water. Over generations, that memory may become mythic. The drowned plain becomes a paradise lost. The advancing tide becomes punishment or purification. The survivors become chosen ancestors. The hill they climbed becomes a sacred mountain. The boat they used becomes the first ark. The animals they saved become the animals of the renewed world. This does not mean that all flood myths are direct records of sea level rise. Myth is too rich, too layered, too symbolic for such a simple explanation. But sea level rise at the end of the Ice Age provided one of the greatest real backgrounds imaginable for stories of drowning and survival. It gave humanity a world in which the ocean truly did swallow lands. It gave memory something vast to work upon. There is a strange comfort in knowing that beneath the waves there were once human places. It reminds us that history is not limited to ruins above ground. The sea floor is also a library. Its books are buried in silt, shell, peat, and stone. Every submerged forest is a paragraph. Every ancient river channel is a sentence. Every tool lifted from a fishing net is a word from a language almost lost. Marine archaeologists, geologists, and paleoclimatologists are slowly learning to read this library. They map ancient coastlines with sonar. They take sediment cores. They study pollen, shells, microfossils, and chemical signatures. They reconstruct landscapes from drowned soils. Their work is patient and difficult, but it expands the human story. It tells us that our ancestors did not live only in caves and inland plains. They lived beside coasts that no longer exist, in countries the ocean has hidden. As night falls over this chapter of the ancient earth, let us return once more to Doggerland. The sky is low and silver. The tide moves through channels that were once footpaths. A family stands on a rise, looking back toward smoke from a camp they will soon abandon. The oldest among them remembers when the land beyond the marsh was dry. The youngest will remember only water. Between those two lives, a country disappears. No monument marks the loss. No written record names the dead. The sea takes the hearth, the path, the bones, the stories tied to particular stones. But it does not take everything. The people turn inland. They carry tools, embers, children, songs, and warnings. Behind them, the water spreads over the plain. Ahead of them, new lands wait, uncertain and difficult. Above them, the stars shine with the same cold patience they showed over the glaciers. And under the rising tide, the drowned country enters the long sleep of the sea. Long after the water fell silent, the stories remained. They traveled farther than rivers, farther than coastlines, farther than the bones of drowned animals and the stones left beneath the sea. They moved from mouth to mouth, from grandmother to child, from hunter to farmer, from village fire to temple courtyard, changing their clothing with every language, but keeping something old alive inside them. Across the world, people told of a time when water covered the land. In some stories, the flood came because humanity had become wicked. In others, it came because gods quarreled, because a cosmic order had broken, because the sky opened, because the sea crossed its boundary, or because a warning had been given to one person wise enough to listen. There were boats, rafts, mountains, birds, seeds, animals, and survivors. There was terror, but also renewal. The flood destroyed, and then it began the world again. To modern ears, these stories often sound like religion or myth, and they are. But myth is not the opposite of memory. Myth is memory shaped until it can survive. It carries facts poorly sometimes, but feelings with astonishing strength. It may lose dates, names, and measurements, yet preserve the emotional outline of catastrophe. The warning, the disbelief, the rising water, the desperate climb, the vessel, the silence after the storm, and the terrible sight of a changed world. If the end of the Ice Age was an age of rising seas, bursting lakes, shifting rivers, and drowned homelands, then it gave human memory more than enough raw material for flood traditions. We must be careful and honest. There was not one single global flood that covered every mountain at once in the way some later traditions describe. Geology does not support that image. The story was more complex and, in some ways, more haunting. There were many floods, many seas rising, many coasts lost, many valleys drowned, many rivers transformed. Some disasters happened in days. Others happened across lifetimes. A glacial lake could break through an ice dam and send a wall of water across a continent. A sea could rise slowly enough to be measured in stories rather than screams. A tsunami could strike a coast already weakened by centuries of encroaching tides. A river civilization could be devastated by a seasonal flood so enormous that it seemed to reset the world. The flood myths of humanity may not remember one event. They may remember a world in which water repeatedly crossed the line between life and death. In ancient Mesopotamia, among the cities of Sumer and Akkad, the flood became one of the great stories of civilization. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the hero hears the tale of Utnapishtim, a man warned by a god to build a great boat before a devastating flood destroys humanity. He brings aboard his family, craftsmen, animals, and precious things. The storm comes with terrifying force. The gods themselves are frightened by what they have unleashed. After the waters calm, the boat comes to rest, birds are released, and sacrifice is offered. The story is older than the written tablets that preserve it, and it belongs to a landscape where rivers were both blessing and threat. The Tigris and Euphrates could feed fields, carry trade, and support cities, but they could also flood violently and unpredictably. For people who built civilization in alluvial plains, flood was not an abstraction. It was the power beneath the grain, the mud, the law, the canal, and the city wall. Later, in the Hebrew Bible, the story of Noah would carry similar themes: warning, ark, animals, rain, judgment, mountain, dove, covenant, and a renewed earth. Whether one approaches these texts as sacred scripture, literature, cultural memory, or all three, they reveal a deep ancient conviction. Water could cleanse the world by destroying it. In India, a great flood story appears in traditions concerning Manu, the ancestor of humankind. A small fish warns Manu of a coming deluge and asks for protection. As the fish grows, it reveals divine nature and instructs Manu to build a boat. When the waters rise, the fish guides the vessel to safety, often toward a mountain, and from Manu, the human world is renewed. Here again we meet the pattern: warning, preservation, vessel, mountain, rebirth. But the emotional texture differs. The rescuer appears first as something fragile, a fish needing care. The one who will survive is the one who listens to and protects the small voice before disaster. That is a profound lesson from a world of environmental uncertainty. Catastrophe may announce itself softly. Survival may begin as attention. In ancient Greece, the flood of Deucalion and Pyrrha tells of a world destroyed by the anger of Zeus. The surviving couple rides out the waters in a chest or vessel, lands upon a mountain, and helps repopulate the earth. In some versions, they throw stones behind them, which become human beings. Even here, beneath the divine drama, there is an image that belongs to disaster memory, two survivors on high ground after the waters retreat, facing the emptiness of a world that must be remade. In China, flood traditions often take a different form. Rather than one final deluge survived by an ark, many stories focus on the long labor of controlling water. The legend of Yu the Great tells of a hero who tames devastating floods not by simply blocking them, but by dredging channels and guiding waters to the sea. This is a civilization-building flood myth. It does not only ask who survived, it asks who learned to manage water. That distinction matters. In river valleys where agriculture, settlement, and political authority depended on irrigation and flood control, the great hero is not merely the one who escapes the flood, but the one who organizes society to live with it. This may be one of the clearest bridges between ancient catastrophe and civilization. Water-forced coordination. Coordination required leadership, memory, labor, calendars, boundaries, and law. In the Americas, many indigenous traditions also speak of floods, though their details vary widely across regions and cultures. Some tell of people escaping to mountains. Some tell of animals diving into the waters to bring up mud from which the world is renewed. Some tell of previous worlds destroyed and remade. In parts of the Pacific Northwest, stories of great waves and shaking earth may preserve memories of tsunamis. In Mesoamerica and the Andes, flood narratives became woven into cycles of creation, destruction, and renewal. Across island cultures of the Pacific, where people lived intimately with ocean, storm, reef, tide, and canoe, stories of sea and flood carried practical and spiritual force. For seafaring peoples, the ocean was not only danger, it was road, ancestor, food source, and cosmic space. A flood story in such a world is not merely about water invading land. It is about the unstable relationship between the human community and the vast living sea. What unites many flood traditions is not identical detail, but recurring structure. First, there is a warning or sign. The wise hear it. The foolish ignore it. Second, there is preparation. A boat built, seeds gathered, animals protected, sacred knowledge preserved, a mountain sought. Third, there is overwhelming water. Fourth, there is refuge. Fifth, there is aftermath. Birds sent out, sacrifices made, laws given, people reborn, or a new covenant formed between humanity and the powers beyond it. This structure makes sense in the aftermath of real environmental trauma. A community that survives disaster needs more than food. It needs an explanation. It needs to know why others died. It needs to teach future generations what to do. It needs to turn grief into order. Story does that work. Story gives catastrophe a beginning, middle, and end, even when the real event was chaotic. Story allows survivors to say, the flood had meaning, and because we remember, the dead are not entirely lost. At the end of the Ice Age, the memory of rising waters may have passed through many transformations before appearing in the written and oral traditions we know. Consider a coastal group forced inland by the sea. In the first generation, the story is practical. The old camp is gone. The water crossed the shell bank. The fresh water turned salty. We move to the ridge. In the third generation, it becomes ancestral. Our grandparents came from the low country now under the waves. In the 10th generation, it becomes sacred. The sea took the first homeland because the world was changing, and our ancestors were guided to safety. After many centuries, if the people become farmers, build villages, and worship gods of storm, sea, and sky, the story may grow into a cosmic flood. The details are not false in the simple sense. They are layered. At the bottom lies water over land. Above it lie grief, migration, ritual, morality, and imagination. Oral memory can be far more durable than many modern people assume. In societies without writing, memory is not casual. It is trained through repetition, song, ceremony, landscape, and social responsibility. A story tied to a place may be repeated for hundreds or thousands of years with enough stability to preserve environmental information. This does not mean every myth is a literal record, but it means we should not dismiss ancient voices too quickly. When a community says the sea was once lower, or an island was once connected to the mainland, or a reef was once dry land, that claim may deserve attention. Modern science has sometimes confirmed that oral traditions contain memories of volcanic eruptions, tsunamis, changing shorelines, and other ancient events. The past speaks in more than one language. Geological cores speak through pollen and sediment. Myths speak through symbols. Both require careful interpretation. Both can be misunderstood, but together they can make the ancient world feel less silent. There is also another reason flood myths became so powerful. Water is the perfect image for both death and birth. Every human being begins life in water. Every field depends on water. Every city needs water. Yet too much water erases boundaries, bodies, houses, and names. A flood dissolves the familiar order of the world. Roads disappear. Graves open. Animals and people are carried together. Clean and unclean, wild and domestic, sacred and ordinary, all are mixed in the same current. When the water retreats, the land is covered in mud, like a newborn world. Seeds sprout. Silt feeds fields. Survivors emerge changed. No wonder ancient people saw floods as divine. They behaved like gods, generous, terrifying, unpredictable, and beyond negotiation. In the centuries after the Ice Age, as humans settled more permanently and began farming in several parts of the world, the importance of flood memory only increased. Farmers cannot simply walk away from every flood. Their fields, stores, houses, and ancestors are fixed in place. Settlement transforms flood from a passing danger into a political and spiritual problem. Who controls the canal? Who repairs the levee? Who decides when water is released? Who stores grain for the bad year? Who interprets the signs of drought and flood? These questions are the foundations of power. The first great civilizations did not arise by escaping water, but by organizing life around it. In that sense, ancient flood myths are not childish explanations of weather. They are deep reflections on the conditions that made civilization possible and fragile. They say, remember the water, because everything you build stands beside it. Let us imagine now a storyteller in an early village thousands of years after the glaciers began to melt. The people live in houses of mud brick and reed. Fields lie beyond the settlement. Channels carry water from a river that both feeds and threatens them. The night is warm. Children lie near their families, listening as an elder speaks. He tells them that in the first days, before the fields were measured, before the walls were raised, before the laws were spoken, there was a flood that covered the world. He tells them that one ancestor listened when others laughed. He tells them that seeds were saved, animals were saved, fire was saved, names were saved. Outside, the river moves in darkness. The children hear it against the bank. They are safe tonight because their parents have repaired the channels, because the granaries are sealed, because the stars and seasons have been watched. But the story tells them that safety is never absolute. It must be renewed, It must be earned through memory. Perhaps that is why flood stories still move us. We live in a world of satellites, tide gauges, climate models, and engineering projects. Yet the old fear remains easy to awaken. We know what it means when water crosses a threshold. We know the helplessness of watching a river rise, a storm surge enter streets, a coastline retreat, a glacier collapse, a home become unlivable. The ancient stories remain powerful because they were never only about the past. They are about the human condition on a changing planet. They ask whether we will listen to warnings. They ask what we will preserve. They ask who gets a place in the boat. They ask what kind of world we will build when the waters fall. At the edge of sleep, flood myths become more than tales. They become echoes from the drowned corridors of human experience. Behind Utnapishtim's boat, behind Manu's fish, behind Deucalion's mountain, behind Yu's channels, behind every story of a people who climbed, floated, waited, and began again, there may be countless unnamed families from the end of the Ice Age. They stood on vanishing shores. They fled river valleys. They watched lakes break open. They carried children uphill in the rain. They returned to find the old places changed beyond recognition. They had no writing, but they had voices. And when they spoke of the water, the world listened. So the flood entered memory. Memory entered myth. Myth entered civilization. And somewhere far beneath the modern sea, under silt and shell and darkness, the old drowned lands remain, holding their silence while their stories continue to rise. When the waters rose and the ice withdrew, humanity did not simply survive. Humanity reorganized itself. The end of the Ice Age was not only a geological turning point, it was one of the great human turning points as well. A long pressure placed upon scattered families, mobile bands, coastal communities, river people, hunters, gatherers, fishers, seed collectors, and early builders. The world that had shaped them was changing faster than inherited memory could easily contain. The old coastlines were gone or going. The old herds were shifting or disappearing. The great plains near the seas were shrinking. Rivers were cutting new paths through soft sediments left by glaciers. Lakes were appearing, draining, and vanishing. Forests spread into some regions while drought hardened others. A person born at the beginning of a generation might die in a world that looked and felt different from the one described by the oldest stories. Under such pressure, human beings did what they have always done. They moved, watched, experimented, argued, remembered, and tried again. This is where the story of flood and climate becomes the story of civilization. Not because one disaster created cities overnight, and not because people suddenly became modern after the Ice Age. The transformation was slower, stranger, and more human than that. Civilization emerged from many experiments across many landscapes, but water was at the center of nearly all of them. Too little water meant hunger. Too much water meant destruction. Water in the right place, at the right time, under some degree of human control, meant fields, storage, villages, surplus, trade, leadership, ritual, conflict, and law. The memory of a world remade by water may have helped teach our ancestors that survival depended not only on courage, but on coordination. In the older Ice Age world, many human groups had followed animals, seasons, and ripening plants across wide territories. Mobility was intelligence. To move was to know the land. To know the land was to live. But after the Great Melt, some regions became richer in stable resources, especially along rivers, lakes, wetlands, and coasts. Fish could be trapped. Shellfish could be gathered. Birds could be hunted in marshes. Wild grains could be harvested in dense stands. Nuts and fruits could be stored. In certain places, people began to remain for longer periods, building shelters that were heavier, burying their dead closer to home, creating storage pits, and returning to the same sites year after year. A camp became a favored place. A favored place became a settlement. A settlement became a world of obligations. Once people build in one place, they begin to think differently. The future becomes tied to a location. A roof repaired today may shelter children next season. Seeds gathered today may feed the group months from now. A burial near the house makes the land ancestral. A wall says this place is ours. A storage pit creates the problem of protection. A field creates the problem of boundaries. Water creates the problem of timing. In this way, settlement did not merely change where people lived. It changed how people imagined time. The old seasonal round had been a circle across the landscape. The new settled life added another circle. Sowing, growing, harvesting, storing, guarding, praying, and beginning again. In the Fertile Crescent, among the hills, valleys, and river systems of Southwest Asia, this transformation became especially important. Long before the first cities, communities gathered wild cereals such as wheat and barley. They hunted gazelle and other animals. They built houses, stored food, and created ritual places. The younger Dryas, with its colder and drier conditions in parts of the region, may have made wild resources less reliable. People who had already begun to depend on certain plants may have responded by tending them more carefully. Perhaps they cleared competing vegetation. Perhaps they returned to the best patches. Perhaps they scattered seeds near camp. Perhaps they learned, slowly, which seeds produced stronger plants and which soils held moisture longer. Farming did not begin as a grand invention. It began as repeated attention. It began with hands sorting grain by firelight. It began with hunger remembering. It began with the quiet decision to help a plant grow where people needed it. When the warmer Holocene climate arrived after the younger Dryas, these experiments expanded. Villages grew. Domesticated plants and animals gradually became central to life in some regions. People built more permanent houses of stone, mud brick, wood, and plaster. They created communal spaces and ritual structures. They developed new relationships with goats, sheep, cattle, pigs, dogs, and eventually many other species. They stored grain and defended it from insects, animals, strangers, and neighbors. The village became a place of cooperation, but also tension. Surplus could feed children, support specialists, and sustain people through lean seasons. But surplus could also be counted, claimed, stolen, taxed, and controlled. Here, in the shadow of climate instability, we begin to see the deep roots of social complexity. Water and grain together created both security and inequality. Farther east, in the valleys that would one day support the Indus civilization, water shaped settlement in different ways. Rivers shifted across broad plains, fed by monsoon rains, mountain snow, and seasonal flows. The people who eventually built towns and cities there learned to live with wells, drainage systems, floodplains, and changing channels. In Egypt, the Nile offered one of the most famous examples of water becoming order. Each year, the river rose and spread life-giving silt across the fields. The flood was not merely a danger, It was the pulse of the world. Egyptian civilization would later build its calendar, agriculture, kingship, and cosmic imagination around the river's rhythm. In Mesopotamia, where rainfall was often insufficient for large-scale agriculture in the south, irrigation became essential. Canals carried water to fields, but canals required maintenance, labor, authority, and planning. If neglected, they silted up or failed. If mismanaged, soils could become salty. Water gave life, but only if people organized themselves around it. In China, flood control became one of the great themes of political myth and early state formation. The legend of Yu the Great, laboring to guide the waters, expresses a profound truth. A ruler earns legitimacy by protecting people from flood and making agriculture possible. Whether we look to the Nile, the Tigris and Euphrates, the Indus, the Yellow River, the Yangtze, or countless smaller river systems, the pattern repeats. Civilization grows where human beings learn to negotiate with water. The end of the Ice Age did not directly build these later civilizations, but it set the stage on which their drama unfolded. It created the warmer Holocene climate, raised seas to near modern levels, reshaped coastlines, stabilized some environments, and forced human communities to adapt to new ecological realities. It may have scattered coastal peoples inland, sending skills, stories, and social habits into river valleys. It may have encouraged the growth of villages by making certain wetlands, lake margins, and river corridors especially productive. It may have made memory itself more valuable, because communities that remembered old disasters were better prepared for new ones. Every canal, levee, granary, calendar, and flood ritual can be seen as a descendant of that ancient lesson. The world changes. Store what can be stored. Build above the water. Watch the sky. Listen to warnings. Keep the seeds dry. There's also the question that has haunted modern imagination for generations. Were there advanced civilizations before the flood, now lost beneath the sea? It is a powerful idea, and it must be handled with both wonder and caution. We have no solid evidence for a lost technological civilization like the ones imagined in fantasy, with metal towers, writing, machines, or global empires before the end of the Ice Age. But the absence of such evidence does not mean the drowned shelves were empty or unimportant. A more realistic and perhaps more moving possibility is that many sophisticated hunter-gatherer and early maritime cultures lived along now submerged coasts. They may have had rich spiritual lives, trade networks, watercraft, seasonal gathering centers, social hierarchies, complex art, and deep knowledge of sea, sky, and land. Because their most important sites may now lie underwater, we may underestimate them. The lost civilizations of the Ice Age may not have been cities of gold. They may have been communities of wood, hide, shell, reed, bone, song, and memory, magnificent in ways that leave few traces. To call them primitive would be a failure of imagination. They crossed dangerous landscapes. They adapted to climate shocks. They understood animals, tides, stone, plants, and stars. Some reached remote islands. Some survived in deserts. Some endured Arctic cold. Some painted caves with unforgettable beauty. Some built early monumental sites before farming was fully established. They were not waiting for civilization to begin. They were living complete human lives inside worlds that later vanished. If the sea covers their camps, it also covers their inventions, their ceremonies, their jokes, their grief, their maps of the heavens, and their names for winds that no longer blow over land. The rise of civilization, then, should not be imagined as a simple ascent from darkness into light. It was a transformation with gains and losses. Farming allowed larger populations, permanent villages, stored food, specialized crafts, temples, writing, and cities. But it also brought harder labor for many people, new diseases from crowded living and animals, social inequality, warfare over land and resources, and dependence on crops that could fail. The river valley gave abundance, but it also tied people to a fragile system. A drought could starve a city. A flood could bury a field. A broken canal could ruin a harvest. Civilization did not free humanity from nature. It bound humanity to nature in new and more complicated ways. Perhaps this is why the memory of flood remains so central. The people who built cities knew, consciously or not, that beneath their walls lay a bargain with forces older than kings. They measured fields after floods because water erased boundaries. They built temples to storm gods because rain could save or destroy. They preserved stories of primeval deluge because their own societies depended on the careful restraint of chaos. In Mesopotamia, the city rose from mud, and the flood could return it to mud. In Egypt, order was imagined as land emerging from the waters of creation, just as fields emerged from the Nile's retreating flood. In many traditions, creation begins when dry land appears from water. That image may feel cosmic, but it is also deeply practical. Every farmer after a flood has seen the world made again from mud. Let us imagine one of the early villages at the edge of this transformation. Dawn rises over a valley in the first centuries of the Holocene. The air is warmer than it had been in the old, cold time. A river moves slowly beyond the houses. Mist lifts from the water. Dogs stir near doorways. A woman steps outside, carrying a basket of grain. She has learned from her mother which seeds to keep, which to grind, which to scatter when the season turns. Nearby, a man repairs a wall around a storage pit. Children chase birds from a patch of ripening plants. An elder sits beneath the shade, watching the river level against a marked stone. The people do not call this civilization. They call it life. Yet inside this ordinary morning are the beginnings of a new human order. Storage, property, inheritance, labor, planning, measurement, and the belief that tomorrow can be shaped by what is done today. Far away, the sea is still rising over old coasts. Far to the north, remnants of ice still melt under summer light. Beneath the North Sea, the plains of Doggerland sleep. Beneath the waters of Southeast Asia, Sundaland is divided into islands. In the memories of many peoples, floods have become stories, and stories have become law, ritual, and identity. The first farmers may not know the full history behind them, but they live in its aftermath. Their fields are planted in a world made possible by melting ice and rising seas. Their villages stand in the warm interval after climate chaos. Their gods, perhaps, are already learning the faces of storm, river, ocean, and rain. As evening comes, the village gathers near a central fire. Someone tells the children not to waste grain. Someone warns them never to sleep too near the river in the wet season. Someone points toward the hills and says that the ancestors once climbed there when the water came. The children listen, their eyes reflecting flame. They do not know which parts are memory and which parts are myth, and perhaps that difference does not matter yet. The story teaches them where safety lies. It teaches them that water has crossed the world before. It teaches them that people survived by listening, preparing, carrying seeds, and beginning again. And in that lesson, quiet but enduring, we can hear the first heartbeat of civilization. The ancient floods are not finished with us. They sleep in the sediments beneath our cities, in the drowned forests under shallow seas, in the myths we still tell our children, and in the quiet measurements of modern scientists watching ice retreat at the edges of the world. 12,000 years ago, humanity lived through a planet in transition. The great ice sheets melted. Seas rose by roughly 400 feet from their glacial low point. Coastal plains became seabeds. Lakes broke through walls of ice. Rivers changed course. People moved, adapted, remembered, and built new ways of life in the aftermath. That story can feel remote, almost dreamlike, because it belongs to a time before writing, before kings, before cities, before the names of nations and the borders of maps. Yet the deeper we look, the less remote it becomes. The end of the Ice Age is not only a story about the past, it is a mirror held up to the present. Once again, the cryosphere, the frozen part of Earth, is changing. Once again, glaciers are shrinking in many regions. Once again, the great ice sheets of Greenland and Antarctica are losing mass. Once again, the sea is rising, not by myth, not by rumor, but by measurement. The scale today is different from the end of the Ice Age, and the causes are not the same. The ancient warming emerged from natural changes in Earth's orbit, greenhouse gas feedbacks, ocean circulation, ice dynamics, and the complex machinery of climate. The warming now is driven largely by human activity, especially the burning of coal, oil, and gas, which releases heat-trapping gases into the atmosphere. But the lesson that joins the two ages is simple and immense. When ice melts, the ocean remembers. The sea does not rise everywhere in exactly the same way. Land rises and sinks. Currents shift. Gravity changes as ice sheets lose mass. Storms and tides shape local experience. But for coastal people, the meaning is direct. Water moves closer. Salt enters soils and aquifers. Storm surges reach farther inland. High tides become more troublesome. Erosion takes beaches, roads, cemeteries, and homes. Islands face difficult choices. Delta cities, built where rivers meet the sea, become more vulnerable. The danger is not only the average height of the ocean, it is the way a higher sea gives every storm a taller starting point. A flood that once would have stopped at the waterfront can enter streets. A tide that once seemed exceptional can become routine. A coastline that seemed fixed in childhood can begin to retreat within one lifetime. This is why the ancient story matters. It teaches us that coastlines are not permanent promises. They are negotiations between land, water, ice, and time. During the Ice Age, people could walk across landscapes now buried under the North Sea, the Persian Gulf, the Sunda Shelf, the Arafura Shelf, and many other shallow seas. They did not lose those worlds in one day, but they lost them. The loss was real, whether it happened through sudden flood, gradual drowning, or repeated storms. Today, we are not hunter-gatherers standing on Doggerland, watching marshes become channels. We have satellites, tide gauges, ice cores, computer models, engineering, written history, and global communication. We know far more than our ancestors could have known, and because we know more, our responsibility is heavier. The old flood stories often begin with a warning. A god whispers to Utnapishtim. A fish speaks to Manu. A sign appears before the waters rise. The wise listener prepares, while others continue as before. In the modern world, the warning does not come as a divine voice from a river. It comes through instruments, data, research stations, coastal surveys, and the accumulated work of scientists across generations. It comes through melting glaciers photographed year after year. It comes through coral records, satellite altimetry, ocean heat measurements, and communities already living with higher tides. The warning is less poetic, perhaps, but no less sacred in its meaning. It says that the world is changing. It says that choices made now will shape coastlines, food systems, migrations, economies, and memories for centuries. It says that ignoring water has always been dangerous. Some people imagine sea level rise as a slow problem, and in one sense, it is. The ocean often advances by inches, by fractions, by statistics that seem too small to frighten the heart. But history teaches that slow forces can have sudden consequences. A shoreline erodes quietly for years, then a storm removes what remains in a single night. A glacier thins gradually, then a shelf collapses. A community tolerates nuisance flooding, then discovers that roads, drains, wells, and insurance systems were built for an older sea. A slow rise becomes a sudden crisis when it crosses the threshold of human infrastructure. This was true in ancient ways as well. The rising sea at the end of the Ice Age may have taken generations to drown certain lands, but for each family forced to leave, departure happened on a particular day. There was a final meal beside the old shore, a final look at the graves, a final crossing of a path that would not be crossed again. Modern people may face similar moments, though with different tools and different scales of choice. A village may move inland, a city may build barriers, a farming region may lose fresh water to salt, a coastal nation may ask where its people can go if the land itself becomes unsafe. Migration is one of the oldest human responses to climate change. Our ancestors moved after droughts, floods, sea level rise, failing herds, shifting rivers, and changing seasons. Movement is not failure. It is part of human survival. But movement can be painful, and when modern populations are large, borders are fixed, and property systems are complex, movement becomes political. The drowned worlds of the Ice Age remind us that climate change is never only environmental. It is social, spiritual, economic, and moral. When a coast disappears, it is not only land that is lost, it is memory, identity, burial ground, language, and belonging. The first farmers learned to live by managing water. They dug channels, watched floods, stored grain, built above wet ground, and turned rivers into calendars. Some succeeded for centuries. Others failed when water systems changed, soils degraded, or drought and flood exceeded what their societies could handle. Their lesson is not that humans are helpless. The lesson is that adaptation requires humility. Water can be guided, but not commanded absolutely. Ice can be studied, but not negotiated with. Atmosphere and ocean respond to physics, not wishes. A society that believes itself separate from nature becomes most vulnerable at the moment nature returns to the center of the story. Yet this chapter should not end in despair. The history of the end of the Ice Age is also a history of resilience. Human beings endured cold reversals, rising seas, lost coasts, vanishing animals, and unfamiliar landscapes. They carried fire across continents. They turned memory into myth, and myth into instruction. They learned to plant, store, build, sail, measure, and organize. They created new forms of life in the wake of disaster. We are their descendants, not only biologically, but imaginatively. We inherit their fear of flood, but also their capacity to prepare. The question is whether we will use that inheritance wisely. Our advantage is knowledge. We can map low-lying coasts before the water reaches them. We can protect wetlands that buffer storms. We can restore mangroves, reefs, dunes, and floodplains where they still have room to live. We can design cities that expect water rather than deny it. We can reduce the emissions that drive future warming. We can plan migration with dignity instead of waiting for panic. We can listen to indigenous knowledge, local memory, engineering, geology, and climate science together. We can decide that the people most exposed to rising seas should not be the least protected. These are not small tasks. But civilization itself began, in part, as a response to water. To manage water is one of our oldest collective arts. To remember flood is one of our oldest duties. Imagine, for a final time, the Earth seen from above at the end of the Ice Age. White ice sheets shine across the north. Brown and green lands stretch outward where seas are now. Rivers braid across exposed shelves. Human fires flicker like tiny stars along coasts, lakes, valleys, and plains. Then time begins to move faster. The ice retreats, lakes swell and burst. The ocean climbs. Doggerland narrows and sinks. Sundaland breaks into islands. The Black Sea changes. The Persian Gulf fills. Beringia disappears beneath cold water. People move like sparks in the dark, carrying names that will vanish. Songs that will change, and stories that will survive in forms no one can predict. Now imagine the Earth from above today. Cities glow along coastlines. Ports spread into estuaries. Roads follow beaches. Airports, factories, neighborhoods, temples, museums, and homes stand near the same restless boundary between land and sea. Far away, ice melts under a warming sky. The connection is invisible from a single street, but it is real. A molecule of carbon, a glacier in Greenland, a tide in Bangladesh, a storm surge in Florida, a village in the Pacific, a subway entrance in New York, a rice field in Vietnam, a coral island in the Indian Ocean, all belong to one planetary story. The ancient flood was not one wave, and neither is the modern crisis. It is a gathering of changes. The old myths ask what we will save when the water comes. Our answer cannot be only one boat, one mountain, one chosen family. The world is too connected now for such a small ark. Our ark must be knowledge, cooperation, compassion, and restraint. It must carry not only animals and seeds, but coastlines, cultures, languages, and futures. It must be built before the night of the storm, not after. As this long story draws to a close, let the mind drift back to that vanished shore 12,000 years ago. The fire is low. The tide is coming in. An elder watches the dark water cover the flats where children once played. He does not know that someday people will speak of ice sheets, meltwater pulses, ocean circulation, or global sea level rise. He knows only that the world can change, that memory matters, and that the young must be warned gently enough to listen and strongly enough to remember. He turns to the children and tells them of the old land beneath the waves. He tells them that the water rose before. He tells them to build on higher ground, to keep the seeds dry, to honor the river, to watch the sky, and to never laugh at warnings carried by small voices. The children grow sleepy. The sea breathes in the darkness. Above them, the stars shine over a planet still becoming itself. Beneath the waves, drowned countries keep their silence. And across the long bridge of time, from the lost coasts of the Ice Age to the uncertain shores of our own century, the same message returns with the tide. The earth remembers water, and so must we. If this story helped you relax, learn something new, or drift a little closer to sleep, please consider supporting the channel by liking the video and subscribing. Your support helps us create more calm, thoughtful journeys into the forgotten corners of history. Share this story with someone who loves ancient mysteries, lost worlds, or peaceful nights of listening. And until our next quiet journey together, may your night be calm, your mind be at ease, and your dreams carry you gently through time.